He carved his legacy out of pure, uncompromising muscle. He is the ultimate American underdog who ran up the steps of Philadelphia, and the indestructible one-man army who survived the most unforgiving jungles on Earth. The entire world knows his crooked sneer, his slurred, iconic voice, and his unparalleled ability to take a devastating punch and keep moving forward. He defined what it means to be a fighter. But behind the billion-dollar franchises and the bronze statues lies a reality that hits harder than any cinematic opponent. At 79 years old, Sylvester Stallone is carrying the unbearable weight of a father who survived the unthinkable, a man who clawed his way out of freezing poverty by selling his only companion, his dog, just to survive, only to eventually build an empire, a superstar who conquered the globe, only to watch helplessly as his firstborn son quietly crossed the threshold, leaving a permanent, echoing silence in the heart of the invincible action god. Sylvester Stallone's life carries a sorrow no boxing ring could ever contain. How does the man who taught the world to never give up find the strength to breathe when life delivers a blow he cannot punch his way out of? What is the secret, agonizing cost of building a fortress of physical perfection when your own heart is breaking behind the armor? And what happens when the ultimate lone warrior realizes his greatest victory isn't winning the fight, but finally allowing his family to heal his wounds? Before we answer these questions, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the legend at 79, you must first know the boy who was born broken. Born broken in the armor of the underdog. There is a manufactured illusion in Hollywood that heroes are born flawless. We are conditioned to believe that the men who conquer the silver screen arrive in this world with perfect symmetry, booming voices, and a destiny written in golden letters. But true legends, the ones who actually resonate with the callous hands and tire hearts of ordinary people, are rarely born perfect. More often than not, they are born broken. They are assembled from the jagged, discarded pieces of a difficult life, glued together by sheer, uncompromising willpower. To understand Sylvester Stallone, the man who would one day become the undisputed global symbol of absolute physical resilience, you must first look at the deeply unfair hand he was dealt on the very first day of his life. You cannot understand the Titan without first understanding the medical accident that was supposed to condemn him to a life of obscurity. On July 6, 1946, in a gritty, unforgiving charity war in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of New York City, a young woman named Jackie Stallone went into a complicated labor. The medical staff, rushing and overwhelmed, was forced to use 2 pairs of heavy, metal forceps to extract the baby. In the chaotic urgency of the delivery room, a catastrophic error occurred. The cold metal blades of the forceps clamped down too hard on the infant's face, violently severing a major facial nerve. When the doctors finally pulled the boy into the world, the physical damage was permanent and undeniable. The lower left side of his face, including parts of his lip, chin, and tongue, was completely paralyzed. For a child born into poverty, life is already an uphill battle. But for a child born into poverty with a visible physical deformity and a severe speech impediment, the world becomes an incredibly cruel, merciless arena. Because of the severed nerve, young Sylvester could not speak clearly. His words were muffled, heavy, and slurred. His mouth naturally rested in a crooked, downward droop. In the brutal, unforgiving hierarchy of the neighborhood streets and schoolyards of the 1950s, a boy who looks different and speaks differently does not receive sympathy. He received the absolute worst of human cruelty. Sylvester was relentlessly, violently bullied. The other children mocked his slurred speech. They called him Sylvia. They laughed at his crooked face. But the cruelty did not just come from his peers. It came from the very institutions that were supposed to protect him. His teachers, completely misunderstanding his facial paralysis and his difficulty articulating words, assumed he was intellectually deficient. They told his mother that his brain was slow. At one point, a teacher looked at the young boy and coldly predicted that he would end up spending his life in a penitentiary, or worse, the electric chair. Imagine the profound, suffocating psychological weight of that childhood. Imagine possessing a vibrant, incredibly creative mind, an ocean of complex thoughts and wild imagination, but being trapped inside a physical vessel that the rest of the world has already labeled as defective. When you look in a mirror and see a crooked smile, and when every time you open your mouth the world laughs at your words, you have only two choices. You can internalize the mockery, surrender to the cruelty, and become the broken thing they say you are. Or you can build a fortress so incredibly strong that nobody will ever dare to laugh at you again. Sylvester chose to build a fortress, and he decided to build it out of pure muscle. His home life offered no safe harbor from the bullying outside. His father, Frank Stallone Sr., was a strict, harsh hairdresser from Italy with a fiery temper, and his mother, Jackie, was an eccentric, domineering force of nature. Their marriage was a chaotic battlefield of loud arguments and emotional turbulence, eventually ending in a bitter divorce. Amidst the screaming and the slamming doors, young Sylvester realized a harsh, defining truth of his existence. Nobody was coming to save him. If he wanted to survive, he had to become his own bodyguard. He found his ultimate sanctuary not in a classroom or a church, but in the darkened rows of local movie theaters and later in the heavy, rusty iron of makeshift gyms. Watching the spectacular, muscular frame of Steve Reeves in the Hercules films, Sylvester experienced a profound revelation. He realized that while he could not magically repair his severed facial nerve, and he could not easily fix his slurred speech, he had absolute, totalitarian control over his own body. He couldn't afford proper gym membership, so he scavenged the junkyards. He lifted heavy cinder blocks. He tied cinder blocks to a broomstick and bench pressed them in the dirt. He built his chest, his arms, and his shoulders with a manic, obsessive dedication. This was not an exercise in vanity. It was an exercise in survival. Every ounce of muscle he packed onto his frame was another layer of armor against the bullies who called him names. He was building a shell so intimidating, so physically overwhelming, that the world would be forced to respect him before he even opened his mouth to speak. I was a guy who was supposed to be nothing, Stallone later reflected. Looking back at the intense, lonely pain of his youth, I was a guy who couldn't talk right, who looked funny. The gym was the only place where I wasn't a joke. The iron never lied to me. The iron never laughed at my face. By the time he reached his late teens, the skinny, mock boy with the drooping lip had transformed himself into a formidable, heavily muscled young man. The bullies had long since stopped laughing, but as the physical armor grew thicker, a magnificent, burning ambition began to take root in his soul. He didn't just want to be left alone anymore. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to prove to every teacher who called him stupid, and every kid who mocked his voice, that he was capable of greatness. In an act of almost incomprehensible, breathtaking irony, the boy with the paralyzed face and the slurred speech decided that he was going to become a Hollywood actor. He packed up his meager belongings and moved to New York City, stepping into an industry that is famously, viciously obsessed with absolute physical perfection. He was walking into a lion's den, armed with nothing but a crooked jaw, a heavy accent, and a dream that everyone around him considered a pathetic delusion. Casting directors took one look at his face, listened to his heavy, muffled pronunciation, and immediately showed him the door. They told him he looked like a mafia thug. They told him his voice was incomprehensible. They told him that leading men looked like Robert Redford, not a punch-drunk street brawler with a paralyzed lip. But Hollywood completely underestimated the profound, unyielding endurance of a man who had been fighting for his right to exist since the very day he was born. They did not know that the very medical accident that was supposed to destroy him, the severed nerve, the drooping lip, the slurred voice, was actually a strange, magnificent gift from a universe. That crooked sneer and that heavy, mumbling voice were completely authentic. They were the undeniable, unfakeable scars of true underdog. Sylvester Stallone was about to take the exact things the world had mocked him for, and he was going to turn them into the most recognizable, beloved, and iconic cultural symbols in the history of American cinema. But before the triumph, there had to be the trial. Before he could wear the championship belt, he had to endure the coldest, most desperate, and most heartbreaking winter of his entire life. A winter where the hunger would become so unbearable and the poverty so absolute that he would be forced to make a sacrifice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The freezing winter, the dog, and the million-dollar defiance. The early 1970s did not welcome Sylvester Stallone with open arms. When he arrived in New York City and later transitioned to the unforgiving streets of Los Angeles, the Hollywood machinery took one look at his drooping lip, listened to his heavy, slurred pronunciation, and immediately slammed the heavy wooden doors in his face. The industry was looking for the blonde, polished perfection of Robert Redford or the intense, theatrical brooding of Al Pacino. They were absolutely not looking for a bulky, brooding Italian-American with a paralyzed face who sounded like he had a mouth full of marbles. For nearly 5 years, Sylvester endured a level of poverty that strips a man of his basic human dignity. We are not talking about the romanticized, artistic poverty of a struggling actor living in a bohemian loft. We are talking about freezing, desperate, grinding destitution. He was evicted from his apartment. For an agonizing stretch of time, he slept in the gritty, dangerous terminal of the Port Authority bus station in New York for 3 weeks, simply because he had nowhere else to close his eyes. He took jobs cleaning up the lion cages at the Central Park Zoo, shoveling manure just to afford a cheap sandwich. His shoes had holes in them. His clothes smelled of desperation. By the winter of 1975, he had reached the absolute, terrifying bottom of the abyss. He was 29 years old, living in a dingy, freezing apartment in Los Angeles with his pregnant wife, Sasha. He had slightly over $100 in his bank account, but amidst this crushing, suffocating darkness, Sylvester had one profound source of light. He had one friend in the entire world who did not care that his face was crooked, who did not judge his slurred speech, and who never, ever asked him for a success story. It was a massive, wrinkled, fiercely loyal bull mastiff named Butkus. Butkus was not just a pet. He was a silent confidant. When the casting directors laughed Sylvester out of the room, he would go back to his freezing apartment, sit on the floor, and bury his face in the dog's heavy neck. The dog was his ultimate sanctuary. But extreme poverty is a ruthless, unfeeling monster. It does not respect love. As the winter raged on, Sylvester found himself in an impossible, devastating predicament. He could no longer afford to buy food for himself, let alone for a 140-pound mastiff. The dog was beginning to starve. Driven by absolute desperation, with tears blurring his vision, Sylvester made a decision that would haunt the darkest corners of his memory for the rest of his life. He walked Butkus to a local liquor store. He stood outside in the freezing cold, holding a handwritten sign, offering his best friend to any stranger who would take him. A man walked by, negotiated the price, and handed Sylvester $40. Sylvester handed over the leash. He watched the stranger walk away with the only creature on earth who unconditionally loved him. I tied him up at a liquor store, and I sold him for $40 because I couldn't afford food, Stallone later confessed, his voice heavy with the agonizing memory of that day. I walked away crying. It was the lowest point of my entire existence. I was completely broken. With the $40, he bought a cheap meal and some basic supplies. He was a man who had entirely lost his pride, his companion, and seemingly his future. But sometimes the universe demands that a man be completely, violently emptied out before he can be filled with something magnificent. Just a few weeks later, on the evening of March 24th, 1975, Sylvester spent the last of his spare change to buy a ticket to watch a closed-circuit broadcast of a boxing match. It was a heavily favored, undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali, fighting a massive, clumsy, unknown underdog named Chuck Wepner. The entire world expected Ali to destroy Wepner in the first 3 minutes, but Wepner refused to go down. He took a brutal, sickening beating, his face turning into a mask of blood, yet he kept moving forward. In the 9th round, the impossible happened. The unknown underdog landed a heavy blow and actually knocked Muhammad Ali to the canvas. Wepner eventually lost the fight, but he won the ultimate victory. He survived against the god of boxing. He proved he belonged in the ring. As Sylvester sat in the dark theater, Watching the battered, bloody underdog refuse to stay down. Something deep within his paralyzed face and exhausted soul violently clicked. He was not just watching a boxing match. He was watching the metaphor of his own pathetic, beaten-down life. He rushed back to his freezing apartment. He locked the door, sat down at a cheap, battered typewriter, and began to write. For 3.5 days, he did not sleep. He barely ate. The words poured out of him with frantic, manic, almost divine urgency. He wasn't writing a movie about boxing. He was writing a movie about a lonely, uneducated, broken-down man whom the world had labeled a bum. A man who just wanted to prove that he wasn't just another bum from the neighborhood. He wrote his own pain, his own slurred speech, and his own desperate need for dignity into character of Rocky Balboa. When the sun rose on the 4th day, the script for Rocky was finished. He took the script to producers Irwin Winkler and Robert Chardoff. The executives read it and were absolutely blown away. The script was a masterpiece of raw, emotional, working-class American cinema. They immediately saw the billion-dollar potential. They envisioned a massive, prestigious production starring established, beautiful leading men like Ryan O'Neal. Burt they offered Sylvester Stallone, the broke actor who had just sold his dog for $40, an incredible sum, $125,000 for the rights to the script. But Sylvester shook his head. He laid down one absolute, non-negotiable condition. He must play Rocky Balboa. If he did not star in the movie, there would be no movie. The executives laughed. They told him it was impossible. The studio would never greenlight a major motion picture starring an unknown, mumbling actor with a paralyzed lip. A few days later, they called back. They raised the offer to $250,000. Sylvester refused. They called back again. They raised the offer to $360,000. Stop and consider the sheer, terrifying magnitude of this moment. This is a man with exactly $106 in his bank account. A man whose wife is pregnant. A man who was so destitute he had to sell his beloved dog to a stranger. $360,000 in 1975 was life-changing generational wealth. It was the ultimate temptation. But Sylvester Stallone understood something that the man in the expensive suits did not. He understood that if he sold the soul of his creation just to buy a comfortable life, he would spend the rest of his days hating the man in the mirror, recalling that legendary boardroom standoff. Stallone delivered one of the most powerful, defining quotes of his entire life. I thought, you know what? I've got nothing to lose. I've been poor my whole life. I know how to be poor. I know how to sleep on a park bench. If I sell this script and it becomes a huge hit with someone else, I'll throw myself off a building. I would rather bury in the backyard than watch someone else play my life. Faced with an immovable, absolute will of iron, the studio finally surrendered. They agreed to let him star as Rocky Balboa, but they punished him for his stubbornness. They slashed the production budget to a microscopic $1 million. They pay him a mere $35,000 for the script and his acting fee combined. They told him that if the movie went a single dollar over budget, he would be held personally, legally responsible. Sylvester didn't care. He had won the ultimate fight. He had defended his dignity. But before he stepped onto movie set, before he put on the boxing gloves, he had one incredibly urgent, desperate piece of unfinished business to attend to. With his $35,000 check secured, Sylvester walked straight back to the liquor store where he had sold his dog. For 3 agonizing days, he stood on that street corner, waiting, hoping, praying that the stranger would return. On the 3rd day, the man appeared, walking the massive bull mastiff. Sylvester approached him and begged to buy the dog back. He offered the original $40. The man refused. He offered $100. The man refused. In the end, Sylvester paid the stranger $3,000, an exorbitant, almost extortion amount of money, and even had to promise the man a cameo in the movie just to get his dog back. But as Butkus leaped into his arms, licking his crooked, tear-stained face, Sylvester didn't care about the money. He fell to his knees on the concrete, wrapping his massive arms around the dog. The pack was reunited. The freezing winter was finally over. If you watch the original 1976 film Rocky, look closely at a massive dog running alongside Sylvester during his legendary training montage through the streets of Philadelphia. That is not a trained Hollywood animal. That is Butkus, the very dog he sold to survive, and the very dog he bought back to share his triumph. When Rocky premiered in 1976, it didn't just win the Academy Award for Best Picture. It grossed over $225 million worldwide. It became a cultural monument. The skinny, mocked boy with the paralyzed lip had run up the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, throwing his fists into the air, and the entire planet cheered for him. He had forged an indestructible golden armor. He had transformed his pain into absolute power. But as he stood on the summit of the world, preparing to become the ultimate action god of the 1980s, Sylvester Stallone was about to discover a terrifying new reality. The armor he had built to protect himself from the bullies of his youth was about to become a magnificent, suffocating trap. And the muscles that allowed him to conquer Hollywood would prove entirely useless when fate decided to strike a devastating blow to his own family. The golden armor and the trap of the Titan. When a man achieves the impossible, when he runs to the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, raises his fist in triumph, and forces the entire globe to chant his name, the world expects him to finally relax. They expect the hungry, desperate underdog to sit on his throne, count his millions, and enjoy the beautiful, comfortable fruits of his labor. But Sylvester Stallone could not relax. The boy who was born with severed facial nerve, the teenager who had to build a fortress of muscle just to walk safely down the street, fundamentally did not know how to stop fighting. The success of Rocky in 1976 was not a finish line for Sylvester. It was the ringing of a bell for round two. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the cultural landscape of Hollywood underwent a massive, testosterone-fueled transformation. The quiet, philosophical cinema of the previous decade was replaced by an insatiable public demand for absolute, unyielding physical demigods. And in this new, hypermasculine arena, Sylvester Stallone found himself locked in the most intense, legendary, and grueling rivalry in the history of modern entertainment, his box office war with Arnold Schwarzenegger. To understand the sheer magnitude of this era, you must understand what it required of the human body. Arnold was a literal Hercules, a 7-time Mr. Olympia, who possessed a genetic structure that seemed sculpted out of pure Austrian granite. To compete with a titan of that magnitude, Sylvester, who was naturally a much smaller build, had to subject himself to a regimen of physical punishment that bordered on absolute madness. In 1982, Sylvester introduced the world to his second immortal archetype, John Rambo, in the brilliant, psychologically haunting film First Blood. Initially, the character of Rambo was a traumatized, deeply broken Vietnam veteran struggling with the agonizing shadows of severe PTSD. He was a tragic figure. But as the decade progressed and the sequels were greenlit, the audience demanded more explosions, more violence, and more muscle. They did not want a broken soldier. They wanted a mythological god of war. Sylvester gave them exactly what they demanded, but the physical cost was staggering. In preparation for films like Rocky III and Rambo, First Blood Part 2, Sylvester treated his own body like a laboratory experiment in extreme human endurance. He drank 25 cups of black coffee a day to suppress his appetite. His daily diet consisted of a few oatmeal cookies, brown rice, and raw tuna. He engaged in brutal, agonizing training sessions, lifting weights until his hands bled, running miles in the scorching heat, and sparring hundreds of rounds. By the mid-1980s, he had reduced his body fat to an impossible, dangerously low 2.9%. His skin was pulled tightly over a roadmap of bulging, vascular muscle. He looked as though he'd been carved out of pure, indestructible bronze. Reflecting on the terrifying extremes he pushed himself to, Stallone later admitted the unvarnished, physical horror of his routine. I was basically existing on a diet that would starve a normal person. I was so physically depleted, so dehydrated to get that vascular look for the camera, that I would literally do a handstand between takes just to get blood to flow back into my head. so I wouldn't pass out. I was a walking science experiment. The media marveled at his physique. Millions of young men hung his posters on their bedroom walls. He was earning $20 million a picture, flying in private jets, and shaking hands with presidents. But behind the bulging veins and the deafening roar of the machine guns, a profound, deeply hidden psychological mechanism was at work. Why does a man who already has hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank subject himself to the edge of physical starvation and collapse? Why construct a body that looks like it could survive a nuclear blast? Because the golden armor he was building was not just for the cameras. It was for the frightened little boy from Hell's Kitchen. In the quiet, unspoken architecture of his mind, Sylvester still carried the agonizing memories of being called stupid by his teachers, of being mocked for his crooked, drooping lip, of being tossed out onto the freezing streets of New York City. He subconsciously believed that if he became the strongest, most physically flawless, most heavily armored creature on the planet, the world would never, ever be able to hurt him again. If he was Rambo, nobody could laugh at his slurred speech. If he was Rocky, poverty could never touch him. He built a golden, impenetrable fortress around his heart, convinced that absolute physical supremacy equated to absolute emotional safety. But this is the great, tragic trap of the Titan. Armor is designed for war. It is heavy, rigid, and incredibly cold. It is built to deflect bullets and absorb devastating punches. But armor is completely useless when you walk to the front door of your own home. You cannot wear a golden fortress when you are trying to hold a newborn baby. You cannot flex your muscles to fix a fractured marriage. As Sylvester conquered the globe throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, his personal life became a chaotic, deeply painful casualty of his overwhelming ambition. The relentless, exhausting schedule of shooting back-to-back blockbusters required him to spend months away on remote movie sets. When he was home, the extreme diets, the physical exhaustion, and the immense pressure maintaining his global empire left him emotionally drained, distant, and intensely guarded. His first marriage to Sasha Zach, the woman who had stood by him during the freezing, desperate days when he had to sell his dog, buckled under the unbearable weight of his massive fame. The quiet, struggling actor she had fallen in love would have been entirely swallowed by the global phenomenon of the action star. They officially divorced in 1985. He plunged into a highly publicized, chaotic, and short-lived marriage with the glamorous actress Bridget Nielsen. It was a union that played out in the ruthless glare of the paparazzi flashbulbs, a marriage of two larger-than-life personas that ended in a bitter, explosive separation just 2 years later. To the outside world, Sylvester Stallone was living the ultimate fantasy. He was untouchable. He was a reigning king of the action genre, a man who could defeat entire armies with a single bow and arrow. But inside the echoing halls of his spectacular mansions, the king was beginning to realize that he had built a magnificent golden prison. He had achieved everything he ever dreamed of as a starving artist, but he had lost a quiet, ordinary piece of a stable home. And then, the universe delivered a quiet, agonizing reality check. It was a profound lesson that all the bench presses, all the box office records, and all the millions of dollars in the world could not alter. In the early 1980s, during his first marriage to Sasha, his second son, Seargeoh, was born. Seargeoh was a beautiful, quiet boy. But as he grew, the parents noticed that he was not developing like other children. He was incredibly withdrawn. He struggled to communicate. He lived in a quiet, isolated world of his own. When the doctors finally delivered the diagnosis, it hit the invincible action star harder than any punch he had ever taken in a boxing ring. Seargeoh was diagnosed with autism. For a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that every single obstacle could be overcome through sheer willpower, intense training, and physical force, this diagnosis was an absolute, shattering paradigm shift. You cannot fight autism. You cannot punch it into submission. You cannot rewrite the script or fire the director. You cannot lift heavy weights to make it go away. For the first time in his life, the ultimate warrior was entirely powerless. Sylvester had to take off the golden armor. He had to look at his beautiful, silent son and realize that being a father to a child on the autism spectrum required a completely different kind of strength. It did not require bulging muscles or a machine gun. It required immense patience, deep vulnerability, and the heartbreaking acceptance that some battles in life simply cannot be won. They can only be met with unconditional love. It was the beginning of a profound spiritual awakening for the bruised and exhausted superstar. The invincible Rambo was slowly learning how to become a human being again. But just as he was beginning to navigate the complex, delicate terrain of fatherhood, fate was quietly sharpening a blade in the darkness. The universe had proven that it could bypass his physical armor. Decades later, it would return to deliver a blow so catastrophic, so absolutely devastating, that it would bring the Titan completely to his knees. The cinematic confession and the shedding of armor. There is a terrifying, inescapable mirror that art sometimes holds up to reality. A movie set could be a place of magnificent illusion, a sanctuary where an actor hides behind explosions, scripts, and meticulously crafted costumes. But occasionally, if an artist is brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, the camera becomes a confessional booth. It strips away the armor and forces a man to look directly at the wreckage he has left behind in the real world. By the late 1980s, Sylvester Stallone was not just a famous actor. He was a global industry. He was spending months at a time shooting in remote jungles and distant countries, completely consumed by the relentless demands of maintaining the billion-dollar franchises of Rocky and Rambo. But while the Titan was busy conquering the globe, his firstborn son, Sage Stallone, was growing up in the massive, echoing, and profoundly lonely shadow of an absent father. Born in 1976, exactly the same year that Rocky transformed his father from a starving, struggling writer into a cinematic god, Sage's entire childhood was defined by his father's overwhelming fame and physical distance. When a man is spending 20 hours a day building a golden, impenetrable fortress of muscle and box office dominance, he is inherently failing to build a quiet, mundane, and absolutely necessary foundation of a father-son relationship. In 1990, as Sylvester prepared to shoot Rocky V, he made a creative decision that was as breathtakingly vulnerable as it was heartbreaking. The script called for Rocky Balboa to neglect his own son, Robert, while pouring all his attention and time into training a young, hungry protege named Tommy Gunn. Instead of casting a traditional child actor for the role of his neglected son, Sylvester cast his own 14-year-old boy, Sage. It was a staggering collision of fiction and reality. On the sound stages of Philadelphia in the winter of 1990, millions of dollars were being spent to film a father and son confronting the exact, painful emotional chasm that existed between them in real life. There's a specific, incredibly powerful scene in Rocky V where the teenage boy finally erupts. He screams at Rocky, his face twisted in genuine pain, yelling that his father never had time for him, that his father only cared about his fighter, and that he was completely abandoned. Years later, in a remarkably candid interview in 1996, Sage Stallone revealed the absolute, unvarnished truth about that day on set. He did not use Hollywood public relations spin. He spoke with the raw, lingering pain of a son who just wanted his dad. When I was screaming, "You never spent time with me. You never spent time with my mother," that was true. I was looking directly into my father's face and saying that. I was letting it all out. After that film, everything changed. We let a lot of things out. We cried a few times. We would do anything for each other now. Imagine the sheer emotional weight of that moment for Sylvester Stallone. He was standing under bright, unforgiving studio lights, listening to his own flesh and blood deliver a devastating indictment of his fatherhood. The invincible action hero, the man who could take a brutal beating from Apollo Creed and Ivan Drago without ever staying down, was completely brought to his knees by the tears of his 14-year-old boy. It was the ultimate cinematic confession. Sylvester used the movie to apologize to his son in front of the entire world. He allowed Sage to strike the blow that finally shattered the golden armor. It was the beginning of a profound, beautiful healing process between them. They spent the ensuing years rebuilding their bond, transitioning from a distant superstar and a neglected child into genuinely close, deeply connected friends. But as Sylvester was doing the difficult, necessary work of repairing his soul and his family, the Hollywood machinery was beginning to turn its back on him. The 1990s brought a seismic shift in cinematic tastes. The era of the indestructible, silent, oiled-up action demigod was coming to an end. Audiences wanted vulnerability. They wanted flawed, complex heroes. Sylvester tried to adapt by starring in a string of comedies and sci-fi films like Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot and Judge Dredd, but they were critical and commercial misfires. The media, which had worshipped him a decade earlier, began to mock him. They wrote cruel articles declaring that he was a relic of the 1980s, a one-trick pony who only knew how to grunt and shoot a machine gun. Once again, the world was telling the boy from Hell's Kitchen that he was finished. Once again, they were laughing at his slurred speech and his crooked jaw. But the critics vastly underestimated the profound, quiet intelligence of Sylvester Stallone. He knew that to survive, he had completely destroyed the very image that had made him a billionaire. In the summer of 1997, a young director named James Mangold offered Sylvester the lead role in a gritty, independent crime drama called Copland. The role was Freddie Heflin, a soft-spoken, partially deaf, deeply depressed, and overweight small-town sheriff who had given up on his dreams. The film was going to star the absolute royalty of American acting: Robert De Niro, Harvey Keitel, and Ray Liotta. The studio executives could only offer a meager $100,000 a role, a microscopic fraction of Stallone's usual $20 million fee. Sylvester did not hesitate. He took the job. And then he did the unthinkable. The man who had spent 15 years treating his body like a temple, who had starved himself on raw tuna and black coffee to maintain a superhuman 2.9% body fat, deliberately set out to ruin his magnificent physique. He stopped lifting weights. He started eating giant stacks of pancakes, massive bowls of pasta, and heavy desserts. He gained over 40 pounds of soft, visible fat. His chiseled jawline disappeared. The bulging, vascular biceps vanished beneath a layer of lethargic weight. He physically dismantled Rambo. He buried Rocky Balboa. When he stepped onto the set of Copland, standing shoulder to shoulder with Robert De Niro and Harvey Keitel, he was utterly unrecognizable. He was tired. He was heavy. His shoulders slumped with the weight of a man who had been defeated by life. When the film was released in August 1997, the critics were absolutely stunned. They had spent a decade dismissing him as a mindless action figure, but in Copland, Sylvester delivered a performance of breathtaking, heartbreaking subtlety. He proved, unequivocally, that beneath the muscles, the explosions, and the legendary sneer, there was a deeply sensitive, profoundly gifted actor. He didn't need to fire a weapon to command a scene. He simply needed to use his heavy, soulful eyes. Reflecting on this monumental artistic risk, Sylvester laid bare the absolute necessity of destroying his own ego. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't just a physical presence. I felt like a prisoner in my own body. Gaining the weight, losing the vanity, it was the most liberating experience of my life. I realized I didn't have to be perfect anymore to be worthy. That single quote captures the magnificent, mature evolution of Sylvester Stallone in the late 1990s. He had spent his entire life trying to be perfect, trying to be indestructible, trying to build an armor so thick that nobody could ever hurt the little boy who was born with a paralyzed face. But in his 50s, he finally realized that the armor was suffocating him. He realized that true strength, both as an artist and as a father, was found in vulnerability. It was found in looking at his son Sage and saying, "I'm sorry I wasn't there." It was found in looking at the world with an extra 40 pounds of fat and saying, "I am flawed and I am human." By the late 1990s, the turbulent storms of his personal and professional life were finally beginning to settle. In 1997, the exact same year, he proved his acting genius in Copland. He married the beautiful, grounded entrepreneur Jennifer Flavin. It was a marriage that would bring him 3 magnificent daughters, Sophia, Sistine, and Scarlett. He was no longer the absent superstar. He was becoming the devoted, present patriarch he had always secretly longed to be. His relationship with his eldest son, Sage, had blossomed into a profound mutual respect. Sage had grown into a brilliant, encyclopedic film aficionado, started his own successful company that restored classic horror movies. He was no longer living in his father's shadow. He had carved out his own unique, respected path, and Sylvester was overwhelmingly, incredibly proud of the man his boy had become. For the first time in his chaotic, spectacular existence, Sylvester Stallone was truly at peace. The boy from the charity ward had conquered the world, slain his demons, repaired his family, and found a quiet, beautiful harbor. But the universe, with its incomprehensible and terrifying timing, was merely letting him catch his breath. The skies were clear, the family was whole, and the legend was finally resting. Yet, waiting just over the horizon of the new millennium was a day that would deliver a blow so devastating, so completely unsurvivable, that it would bring the greatest fighter in cinematic history to his knees, begging the universe to take his life instead. The unthinkable blow in the empty ring. There is a fundamental, inescapable truth about the sport of boxing. A fighter spends his entire life learning how to protect himself. He learns how to tuck his chin, how to raise his gloves, and how to brace his core against a devastating body shot. He builds calluses over his bones and thickens his skin. But a father's heart does not reside behind his rib cage. A father's heart walks around entirely exposed, completely unprotected, living and breathing inside the fragile chest of his child. And when the universe decides to strike that unprotected heart, no amount of muscle, no amount of wealth, and no amount of cinematic invincibility can soften the blow. By the summer of 2012, Sylvester Stallone had achieved a magnificent golden autumn in his life and career. He was 66 years old. He had successfully resurrected his career yet again by creating the Expendables franchise, uniting the greatest action stars of his generation into a massively successful, joyful celebration of 1980s nostalgia. His personal life was a beautiful, serene harbor. He was deeply in love with his wife, Jennifer Flavin, and was the intensely proud, doting father of 3 radiant teenage daughters, Sophia, Sistine, and Scarlett. But his greatest, most profound source of quiet pride was a relationship he had rebuilt with his firstborn son, Sage. The anger and the distance that had defined their relationship during shooting of Rocky V in 1990 had completely evaporated. Sage was now 36 years old. He was a brilliant, independent man who had forged his own path entirely outside of his father's massive shadow. He had co-founded Grindhouse Releasing, a highly respected company dedicated to restoring and preserving classic, obscure cinema. He was engaged to be married. He was happy, he was loved, and the deep, painful chasms of his childhood had been entirely filled with mutual respect and a beautiful father-son friendship. Sylvester looked at his sprawling family and finally felt that the script of his life was perfect. The boy born in a freezing charity ward had conquered the world and kept his family intact. But on the morning of July 13th, 2012, the telephone rang, and with one incomprehensible, reality-shattering sentence, the invincible titan was brought entirely, permanently to his knees. Sage Stallone was found dead in his Los Angeles apartment. To say that the world stopped spinning for Sylvester Stallone is a catastrophic understatement. When a parent is forced to outlive their child, time does not merely stop. It violently reverses. The natural order of the universe is shattered into a million irreparable pieces. For decades, Sylvester had built an empire by pretending to take punches on screen. He had been hospitalized in real life after asking Dolph Lundgren to punch him as hard as he could during the filming of Rocky IV, spending days in intensive care with a bruised heart muscle. He knew what physical agony felt like, but the agony that washed over him on that July morning was not physical. It was an absolute, suffocating darkness. The man who had built $1 billion empire out of fake blood and choreographed punches was now bleeding from a wound that no surgeon on earth could stitch and no Hollywood script could ever rewrite. His boy, his firstborn son, the child he had held in his arms when he was just a starving, struggling actor typing the script for Rocky in a freezing apartment. Gone, slipped quietly across the threshold, leaving behind an empty room and an echoing, unbearable silence. But the tragedy of losing a child in the modern era is compounded by a profound, disgusting cruelty when you are one of the most famous men on the planet. Almost immediately after Sage's passing, before the family even had a moment to comprehend the staggering reality of their loss, the ruthless machinery of the tabloid media descended like vultures. The internet and the paparazzi began to circulate vicious, sensationalized rumors. Because Sage was a young man in Hollywood, the tabloids immediately, recklessly speculated that his death was the result of drug overdose or reckless substance abuse. They painted a picture of troubled, addicted Hollywood heir, attempting to turn a family's deepest nightmare into cheap, scandalous entertainment. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated horror of that moment for a grieving father. You are standing in the absolute ashes of your shattered world, trying to figure out how to take the next breath without your son. And the world outside your window is screaming lies, attempting to drag your boy's name through the mud. Most men would have collapsed completely. But Sylvester Stallone, drawing upon a reservoir of strength far deeper than any muscle he had ever built, stepped in front of the cameras. He did not step up as Rambo. He did not step up as Rocky. He stepped up as a fiercely protective, completely broken father, demanding absolute respect for the soul of his child. In a statement that completely stripped away the Hollywood bravado and exposed the raw, bleeding nerve of his grief, Sylvester pleaded with the world. When a parent loses a child, there is no greater pain. Therefore, I am imploring people to respect my talented son's memory and feel compassion for his loving mother, Sasha. This agonizing loss will be felt for the rest of our lives. Sage was our first child in the center of our universe, and I am humbly begging for all to have my son's memory and soul left in peace. It was the ultimate, agonizing plea of an exhausted patriarch. Weeks later, the official coroner's report was released, and it completely vindicated the grieving father. The autopsy proved definitively that there were no illegal drugs in Sage Stallone's system. He had not overdosed. The brilliant 36-year-old man had simply suffered a quiet, sudden, and massive heart attack caused by undiagnosed coronary artery disease. His heart had simply given out. The media went quiet. The tabloids moved on to their next victim. But for Sylvester, there was no moving on. How does a man whose entire philosophy is built on the phrase, keep moving forward, take the next step when the road ahead is completely empty? How do you step back onto a movie set and pretend to fight villains when the only fight that ever truly mattered was lost in a silent apartment on a Friday morning? In August of 2012, just weeks after burying his son, Sylvester was contractually obligated to attend the massive, global premieres of The Expendables 2. Look closely at the photographs from that red carpet. Look at the eyes of the man smiling for the flashbulbs. He is wearing a tailored suit. He is waving to thousands of screaming fans. But behind the dark, tinted glasses, you're looking at a man who is functioning on pure, mechanical willpower. You're looking at a father who is performing the most excruciating acting job of his entire life, pretending to be alive while a massive part of his soul is buried in the earth. He survived that impossibly dark winter by leaning completely, entirely on the love of his wife Jennifer and his 3 daughters. He realized that while he could never bring Sage back, he still had a family that desperately needed him. He poured his shattered heart into the women who surrounded him, allowing their fierce, protective love to slowly, gently stitch the pieces of his life back together. 3 years later, in 2015, Sylvester Stallone stepped back into the shoes of his most beloved character, Rocky Balboa, in the critically acclaimed film Creed. But this time, Rocky was not fighting in a ring. He was an old, tired man, battling cancer, mourning the loss of his wife, and acting as a mentor to the son of his deceased best friend. Sylvester took all the staggering grief, all the quiet agony, and all the immense love he still carried for Sage, and he poured it directly into performance. When the film was released, the world was absolutely mesmerized. The tough guy from the 1980s delivered a performance of such profound, heartbreaking vulnerability that it left audiences in tears. In early 2016, Sylvester Stallone walked onto the stage at the Golden Globe Awards to accept the trophy for Best Supporting Actor. The entire room of Hollywood elites, the same industry that had mocked his voice 40 years earlier, gave him a massive, thunderous standing ovation. He held the golden statue, his voice trembling with genuine emotion. It was the ultimate professional triumph. But those who knew him best understood the quiet, invisible truth of that moment. The awards, the applause, and the box office millions were completely secondary. As he looked out at the glittering crowd, the 70-year-old father was not thinking about his career. He was thinking about the boy who used to run alongside him. He was thinking about the son who had crossed the threshold too soon. He had survived the most devastating, unsurvivable blow of his entire life, and he had done it the only way he knew how, by taking the hit, wiping the blood from his eyes, and continuing to stand in the center of the ring, carrying the memory of his boy in every single step he took. The fractured fortress and the ultimate surrender. There is a comforting, yet profoundly deceptive illusion we hold about the autumn of a man's life. We assume that once a man has survived the blistering heat of his youth, conquered his professional demons, and buried his deepest tragedies, the remaining years will be a quiet, uninterrupted victory lap. We imagine the aging hero sitting on his porch, watching the sun go down over a peaceful, unbreakable empire. But human relationships are not statues carved from marble. They are living, breathing, and incredibly fragile ecosystems. They require constant, deliberate nourishment, regardless of whether you are 30 years old or 75 years old. By the dawn of the 2020s, Sylvester Stallone had transitioned into a remarkably beautiful, unexpected phase of his life. He had become the ultimate girl dad. The man whose cinematic legacy was built entirely on sweat, blood, and machine guns was now living in a sprawling, feminine sanctuary. He was entirely surrounded by his beautiful wife of 25 years, Jennifer Flavin, and their three dynamic, intelligent daughters, Sophia, Sistine, and Scarlett. To the outside world, the Stallone household was an absolute fortress of love. The girls adored their father. Jennifer was a grounded, steady anchor who had brought peace to the chaotic, restless heart of the Hollywood titan. They walked red carpets together as a magnificent, united front. He had survived the devastating loss of his son, Sage, largely because Jennifer's fierce, protective loyalty had kept him from completely falling apart in the dark. But behind the towering gates of their Beverly Hills estate, a quiet, invisible erosion was taking place. The tragic flaw of the highly ambitious man is that he often confuses providing for his family with being present for his family. For half a century, Sylvester Stallone's default setting was perpetual motion. Even in his mid-70s, he was still writing, directing, producing, and starring in massive television projects like Tulsa King and churning out action blockbusters. He was still operating under the deeply ingrained, traumatized belief of the starving boy from New York. If I stop working, I will lose everything. But while he was busy meticulously directing the fictional lives of characters on a movie set, he was missing the quiet, unscripted, and entirely irreplaceable moments happening in his own living room. He was physically present, but emotionally miles away, consumed by the relentless machinery of his own legacy. In August of 2022, the quiet erosion finally triggered a devastating landslide. The entertainment world was brought to a stunned, absolute halt when news broke that Jennifer Flavin had officially filed for divorce from Sylvester Stallone. After 25 years of marriage, the anchor was pulling up. The fortress was officially cracking. The media, always hungry for the spectacular destruction of a Hollywood fairy tale, descended immediately. The tabloids ignited a massive firestorm. They pointed out that Sylvester had recently covered up a massive, colorful tattoo of Jennifer's face on his right bicep with a portrait of Butkus, the very dog he had sold and bought back in the 1970s. The paparazzi camped outside their homes. The internet began to speculate, predicting a vicious multi-million-dollar courtroom bloodbath, the kind of bitter, ego-driven war that tears families apart and leaves absolute devastation in its wake. For a brief, agonizing moment, It seemed that the invincible Rocky Balboa was going to lose the one thing he could not afford to live without. Imagine the sheer, terrifying gravity of that month for a 76-year-old man. You have billions of dollars in the bank. You are a global icon. You have a gold star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But you are suddenly facing the very real, freezing prospect of waking up every morning in a massive, echoing, completely empty mansion. You are facing the terrifying reality of losing your best friend and fracturing the hearts of your 3 daughters. When a fighter gets backed into a corner, his natural, biological instinct is to raise his fists and counterpunch. The ego of a deeply proud, historically dominant alpha male usually demands that he fight back, hire ruthless lawyers, and protect his pride at all costs. But this is where Sylvester Stallone proved unequivocally that he had evolved far beyond the characters he played on screen. He did not raise his fists. He did not counterpunch. He did something infinitely more courageous and infinitely more difficult for a man of stature. He dropped his hands, stepped out of the ring, and completely surrendered his ego. He realized that you cannot win back the heart of the woman you love by fighting her. You can only win it back by listening to her. Sylvester took a long, devastating look in the mirror. He stripped away the billionaire actor, the tough guy, and the Hollywood legend, and he forced himself to confront the flawed, distracted, and absent husband he had become. He realized that the empire of his career meant absolutely nothing if the queen was no longer sitting beside him on the throne. He initiated deep, quiet, and intensely private conversations with Jennifer. He did not send publicists or lawyers. He went to his wife. He listened to her grievances. He acknowledged the years of taking her quiet loyalty for granted. He admitted that his obsession with his work had blinded him to the most valuable treasure he actually possessed. In less than a month, the impossible happened. In September 2022, the divorce proceedings were officially halted. The couple reconciled. They were photographed shortly after, walking arm in arm, leaning into each other with the quiet, profound relief of 2 people who had almost driven off a cliff, but hit the brakes just in time. But Sylvester did not just quietly sweep the near disaster under the rug. In a move of breathtaking vulnerability, he spoke publicly about the profound, humiliating, and ultimately life-saving lesson he had learned. Speaking to the press shortly after the reconciliation, the 76-year-old icon delivered a quote that should be etched into the minds of every ambitious man on earth. Let's just say that it was a very tumultuous time. There was a reawakening of what was more valuable than anything, which is my love for my family. It takes precedence over my work. And that was a hard lesson to learn. Sometimes I put the work ahead of my family, and that is a tragic mistake, which won't happen again. Listen to the absolute, unvarnished humility in those words. That was a tragic mistake, which won't happen again. For the audiences watching at home, especially those who have spent decades navigating the incredibly complex, often frustrating, but ultimately beautiful terrain of a long-term marriage, this is the moment Sylvester Stallone truly became a hero. He completely redefined what it means to be a tough guy. For decades, society has been fed a toxic, artificial definition of masculinity. We are taught that a tough guy never backs down, never apologizes, and never admits when he is wrong. But Sylvester proved that true, unshakable strength has absolutely nothing to do with physical muscle. True strength is looking into the eyes of the woman who has stood by you for 3 decades, swallowing your massive pride and saying, "I failed you and I am sorry." True strength is realizing that a sincere apology is not a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate proof of character. True strength is recognizing that the greatest legacy a man can leave behind is not a library of action movies, but a family that actually wants to sit around the dinner table with him when he is old and gray. The fortress did not crumble. In fact, by acknowledging the cracks in the foundation and doing the hard, humble work to repair them, the fortress became stronger than it had ever been. The Stallone family emerged in the crisis with renewed, fierce appreciation for one another. Sylvester began turning down projects that would take him away from home for too long. He began prioritizing the quiet, seemingly mundane moments, walking the dog with Jennifer, having coffee with his daughters, simply being physically and emotionally present in the sanctuary he had almost lost. He had survived the poverty of his 20s. He had survived the physical torture of his 30s. He had survived the unimaginable grief of burying his son in his 60s. And now, in his mid-70s, he had survived his own ego. As the calendar pages turned, pushing him steadily toward the threshold of 80 years old, the storm clouds finally permanently cleared. The boy who was born with a paralyzed face, who had spent a lifetime fighting for his right to exist, was finally ready to put the boxing gloves away for good. The final round was approaching, but for the first time in his chaotic, spectacular life, Sylvester Stallone was not preparing for a fight. He was preparing for peace. The final bell, the canvas, and the ultimate victory. There is familiar, deeply ingrained rhythm to every great boxing movie. The climax always arrives in the final round. The hero is battered, his eyes are swollen shut, and his lungs are burning for oxygen. The music swells, the crowd roars, and with one last superhuman surge of adrenaline, he throws the knockout punch. The referee counts to 10, the bell rings, and the warrior is crowned victorious in a spectacular shower of blood and glory. But real life does not end with a knockout punch. Real life does not offer a swelling orchestral soundtrack when you finally figure out how to be a good husband, or when you learn how to survive the unbearable grief of burying your child. In the real world, the ultimate victory is infinitely quieter. It does not look like a man raising his bruised fists in the center of a roaring arena. It looks like a 79-year-old man sitting peacefully in his garden, entirely surrounded by the people who love him, realizing that he no longer has to fight for his right to exist. As we look at Sylvester Stallone in the year 2026, standing on the very threshold of 80 years old, the transformation is absolutely magnificent. He has officially stepped out of the ring. He no longer subjects his body to the agonizing, terrifying extremes of the 1980s. He no longer drinks 25 cups of coffee a day or starves himself to maintain an impossible, artificial armor of vascular muscle. He has embraced the profound luxury of being a mortal man. His thick, famously dark hair is now a distinguished, unapologetic silver. The deep, heavy lines carved into his face are no longer hidden by stage makeup. They are worn proudly, like the rings of an ancient oak tree that has survived 100 brutal winters. And that famous crooked lip, the paralyzed sneer that was caused by the cold metal of a doctor's forceps in a charity ward nearly 80 years ago, is no longer a source of shame. It is the signature of a survivor. It is the undeniable proof that a man can be born broken and still manage to glue the pieces of his life together to build a masterpiece. Today, if you look for Sylvester Stallone, you will not find him frantically trying to outrun his age in a Hollywood gym. You are far more likely to find him standing quietly in front of a canvas, holding a paintbrush. Long before he ever wrote a script or threw a cinematic punch, Sylvester was a passionate painter. For decades, he used enormous canvases and vibrant, aggressive strokes of oil paint to express the complex, chaotic emotions that his slurred, paralyzed voice struggled to articulate. Today, painting has become his truest sanctuary. It is a quiet, meditative space where he does not have to be Rambo, and he does not have to be Rocky. He can simply be Sylvester, a thoughtful, incredibly sensitive artist pouring his soul into colors and shapes. When he puts down the brush, he returns to the magnificent fortress he has spent the last few years meticulously repairing, his family. The crisis of 2022, which nearly cost him his marriage to Jennifer, fundamentally rewired his soul. Today, he is a man who understands that time is the only currency that actually matters. He is profoundly, beautifully present for his wife. He looks at Jennifer not just as a partner, but as the woman who saved his life, the woman who stayed when the skies turned unimaginably dark, and the woman who taught the ultimate lone wolf how to be part of a pack. He has also leaned entirely into his role as a devoted patriarch to his daughters. He appears on their podcasts. He lets them tease him about his old movies. He offers them the kind of grounded, hard-earned wisdom that can only come from a father who has made every mistake in the book and somehow lived to tell the tale. He is fiercely protective of their hearts, ensuring they never have to feel the freezing, desperate isolation that defined his own youth. He has successfully broken the generational curse of the absent, domineering father. He has replaced the shouting and the slamming doors of his childhood with laughter, patience, and a deep, unconditional grace. When we step back and look at the absolute totality of his staggering 79 years on Earth, the true meaning of his legacy finally comes into perfect, breathtaking focus. For over 4 decades, millions of people around the globe have quoted his most famous cinematic monologue. It is the speech he delivers to his son in the 2006 film Rocky Balboa. He stands on a street corner, his voice heavy with the gravity of a man who has lost almost everything, and he delivers a profound thesis on human existence. Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You, me, or nobody is going to hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. When he wrote those words, he was not writing about boxing. He was writing about the freezing nights sleeping in the Port Authority bus terminal. He was writing about the agonizing tears he cried when he had to sell his dog, Butkus, for $40 just to survive. He was writing about the crushing, paralyzing helplessness of looking at his autistic son, Seargeoh, and realizing his muscles could not cure him. He was writing about the unbearable, world-shattering morning in 2012 when he was told that his firstborn son, Sage, had crossed the threshold and was never coming back. He was writing about the absolute terror of almost losing his wife after 25 years of marriage. Life hit Sylvester Stallone harder than any fictional opponent ever could. It hit him with poverty. It hit him with mockery. It hit him with the unimaginable grief of a parent burying a child. But he took the hits. He absorbed the agonizing, bone-crushing blows of destiny. He wiped the blood from his face. He swallowed his pride, and he absolutely refused to stay on the ground. He kept moving forward. Sylvester Stallone's story is not a Hollywood fairy tale about a man who became a millionaire. It is a gritty, beautiful, and deeply human gospel of endurance. It is the ultimate proof that our scars do not disqualify us from greatness. Our scars are the very credentials that prove we survived the fire. The boy who was born with a paralyzed face in a charity ward didn't just climb the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He climbed the agonizing, towering mountain of his own life. And today, as he stands at the summit, he doesn't need to raise his fists in victory. He just needs to open his arms and embrace the family that climbed the mountain with him. The bell has rung. The fight is over. And the underdog has won the ultimate, everlasting championship of peace. As we close the book on the incredible, bruising, and ultimately triumphant journey of Sylvester Stallone, the camera slowly turns away from a Hollywood legend, and it focuses on you. We all have our own version of the boxing ring. We all have moments where life delivers a blow so heavy, so completely unexpected, that it brings us to our knees. Whether it's the loss of a job, the terrifying diagnosis of an illness, the end of a marriage, or the unbearable grief of saying goodbye to someone we love, life hits all of us. It hits hard, but as Sylvester's journey reminds us, your story does not end on the canvas. Your worth is not defined by how many times you get knocked down. It is defined entirely by your willingness to stand back up, wipe the dust from your eyes, and take one more step forward. What about you? What was the hardest hit life ever delivered to you? When you were on your knees, staring into the dark, where did you find the strength to get back up? Who was the person, or what was a dream, that gave you the courage to keep moving forward? Please, take a moment to share your stories of survival, your struggles, and your hard-earned wisdom in the comments below. There are people reading these comments right now who feel like they're losing their own fight, and your story of resilience might be exactly the hand they need to help pull them back onto their feet. If Sylvester Stallone's legendary journey moved you, if it reminded you that true strength is not about physical muscle, but about the unbreakable endurance of the human heart, please leave a like on this video. Share it with someone you care about, especially someone who might be going through a tough round in their own life. And subscribe to our channel, because we are committed to telling the deep, unfiltered, and profoundly human stories behind the legends we thought we knew. Thank you, deeply and truly, for spending your time with us today. Remember to be kind to yourselves, protect the people you love, and no matter how hard life hits you, keep moving forward.